She was mocked in seat 12F until two fighter jets appeared outside her window, and everyone realized exactly who she was. The woman in seat 12F wasn't the kind of person you'd notice at first glance. That was the point. She preferred it that way. Her name was Commander Nadine Holt, though no one on the plane that morning knew it yet. To the other passengers, she looked like any ordinary traveler making her way from Dallas to Washington. Just another face in the shuffle of boarding calls and overhead bin shuffling. She walked with calm steps down the jet bridge, a small black carry-on at her side, her shoulders squared but relaxed. Her clothes were simple, dark slacks, a plain cardigan, sneakers that had clearly seen many miles. Her short, natural curls framed her face, and her expression was unreadable. She didn't move like a person in a rush, and she didn't carry herself like someone trying to prove anything. Yet, from the moment she reached her row, tension sparked. Seat 12F, window, first class. The man already sitting in 12D, a heavy-set businessman with a gold watch flashing on his wrist, glanced up at her, then at her boarding pass. "You sure you're in the right section?" he asked, his voice dripping with that polite kind of rudeness people use when they think they're being clever. "Yes," Nadine replied, her voice steady but not unkind. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. She slid past him, settled into her seat, and placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her. But he wasn't the only one watching. A younger woman in 11E, 2 rows up, gave Nadine a once-over and whispered something to her companion. Both of them stifled short laughs. Nadine heard it. She always heard it. But she didn't look their way. It wasn't new. She had lived through moments like this more times than she could count. What they saw was a black woman in simple clothes. What they assumed was that she didn't belong in first class, that she was out of place among suits and designer handbags. What they didn't know, and what she had no intention of announcing, was that she had more hours in the sky than half of them combined. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, helping passengers store their bags. Nadine smiled politely when one of them offered to hang her cardigan in the closet, but she declined. She wanted it close. Airplanes were always kept too cold. As boarding finished, she leaned back, folded her hands in her lap, and closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't sleeping. She rarely slept on commercial flights, but she liked to slow her breathing and let her mind grow quiet. Her body had been trained for discipline. Years of service in the Air Force had built a rhythm inside her that didn't go away, even in civilian life. But discipline didn't stop the whispers. The businessman next to her shifted in his seat, adjusting his belt. "You fly often?" he asked casually, not out of friendliness, but out of suspicion. "Often enough," Nadine replied, without opening her eyes. He gave a half smile, shaking his head as though amused. "Well, you picked the right seat. Best one on the plane." She opened her eyes, looked at him just long enough to register his expression, then nodded once before turning her gaze out the window. The conversation ended there. What no one realized in that moment was that this quiet passenger in seat 12F wasn't just another traveler. She was a former squadron commander with a record that demanded respect, even if none of the strangers around her were offering it. And before the flight was over, every last one of them would learn exactly who Nadine Holt was. But trouble in the skies has a way of revealing the truth, and before long, 12F would no longer be ignored. The seatbelt sign dinged on. The plane pushed back from the gate, rolling slowly toward the runway at Dallas Love Field. Nadine adjusted her seatbelt, keeping her movements small, controlled. Around her, conversations picked up like a low current, people catching up on work calls, scrolling through phones, talking about nothing and everything at once. She stayed quiet, but quiet didn't mean invisible. The man beside her, his name, she later overheard, was Douglas Keene, cleared his throat, turned slightly toward her. "So," he said, "Washington, huh? Business or pleasure?" Nadine didn't turn her head. She kept her eyes on the window, watching the service vehicles zip across the tarmac. "Neither," she answered evenly. Douglas let out a short chuckle. "That's vague." "I like vague." He shifted again, clearly unsatisfied. "You live there?" "No." He frowned, as though irritated by the short answers. "You don't say much, do you?" "I say what's needed." His eyebrows lifted, and for the first time his voice sharpened. "Well, all right then." He leaned back, lips tight, as though she had somehow disrespected him by not entertaining his curiosity. 2 rows up, the younger woman, blonde, stylish, maybe late 30s, tilted her head back toward her companion, a man in a tailored blue suit. Nadine didn't need to hear the words. The smirk on the woman's face said plenty. It was the kind of smirk that judged without asking questions, the kind that placed Nadine in a box before knowing a single thing about her. "Excuse me." A flight attendant in her 40s leaned in, checking seatbelts. She smiled at Nadine, then at Douglas. "Can I get you something once we're in the air?" "Whiskey, double," Douglas answered quickly, before Nadine could speak. The attendant nodded. "And for you, ma'am?" "Just water, thank you." Douglas gave a quiet snort, as if her answer confirmed something he already believed about her. Nadine ignored him. The plane turned sharply, pausing at the runway. Engines roared, the pressure built in the cabin. Nadine took a deep breath, steadying her chest the way she always did before takeoff. The nose lifted, the ground dropped away, and soon they were climbing into the blue. Minutes passed. The seatbelt light flicked off. Attendants began their service. Laughter trickled from row 11. Nadine glanced up only when she heard the words, "Probably upgraded by mistake." The blonde woman's voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Nadine's jaw didn't move. She didn't react. Douglas chuckled in agreement. "Yeah, happens sometimes." Nadine finally turned, not to the blonde, not to Douglas, but straight ahead, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She had heard worse in her career. She had endured far more than whispered insults in an airplane cabin. The trick wasn't silence. It was choosing when to break silence. Douglas leaned closer, dropping his voice. "Don't take it personally. Some people just aren't used to seeing—" He cut himself off, but his meaning was clear. His eyes flicked briefly over her skin, her clothes. Nadine's gaze snapped to his, sharp and unflinching. "Some people don't need to be used to it," she said firmly. "They just need to mind their own row." Douglas blinked. His mouth opened, then closed again. For once, he had nothing to add. The attendant returned with drinks. Douglas grabbed his glass too quickly, spilling a few drops on his armrest. Nadine calmly accepted her water, thanked the attendant, and set the cup down untouched. The flight settled into rhythm. Engines droned, the cabin air cooled. People pulled out laptops, headphones, neck pillows, but the tension in row 12 lingered, unspoken yet sharp. Nadine could feel it. She always felt it, like a static charge waiting for the right spark. She didn't raise her voice, didn't push back harder than necessary. Discipline had taught her patience, and still, she knew, patience wouldn't matter for long. Because flights rarely went exactly as planned, and when things began to shift, the same people who whispered now would be forced to see her differently. But storms don't wait for permission. They come when they choose, and this one was already building. Half an hour into the flight, the cabin had settled. Drinks were half empty, laptops glowed with spreadsheets, and the faint sound of earbuds leaked from nearby seats. Nadine rested her elbow on the armrest, gazing out the window at the endless stretch of white clouds below. The seatbelt sign chimed back on. A ripple of murmurs spread as the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're hitting some weather ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Douglas groaned beside her, muttering, "Always happens when I'm trying to enjoy a drink." He swallowed the rest of his whiskey quickly and tightened his belt with one hand. The plane dipped suddenly, not sharply enough to panic, but strong enough to send a few heads jerking up. A child cried somewhere in the back. The blonde in row 11 clutched her companion's arm, whispering something fast and anxious. Nadine's hand remained steady on the armrest. Her breathing stayed calm. She had flown through storms darker than this. Still, something in the shift of the engines caught her ear. A low drag. A correction. She could feel the adjustment before the others realized it. Douglas leaned toward her again. "You don't seem nervous." "I've been in worse," she replied plainly. The plane jolted again, harder this time. Overhead, bins rattled. A few gasps broke through the cabin. Nadine's grip on the armrest tightened, but her expression didn't change. The captain's voice returned, firmer now. "Flight attendants, please take your seats immediately." That sentence, rarely heard, sent an invisible chill through the rows. When attendants were told to sit, passengers knew things were serious. One of them hustled down the aisle, bracing against the sway of the aircraft. She stopped at row 12, crouched quickly. "Sir, ma'am, are you buckled tight?" "Yes," Nadine answered. Douglas nodded, though his face had gone pale. The attendant gave Nadine a longer glance, almost as if she could sense her composure stood out. Then she hurried on. Moments later, the turbulence steadied, but the captain didn't return with reassurance. Instead, the silence from the cockpit stretched too long. Nadine's instincts stirred. Something was off, not just bad weather. She tilted her head, listening. She could almost picture the flight deck, the captain and first officer scanning radar, adjusting heading, exchanging clipped words. She knew that rhythm. She had lived it. Douglas cleared his throat. "What do you think's going on?" Nadine finally looked at him. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "We may have drifted where we shouldn't have." His brows furrowed. "What does that mean?" She didn't answer. Not yet. Then it happened. A shadow swept across the window, fast as lightning. Nadine's eyes snapped to the right just in time to see it. Sleek, gray, slicing through the sky with authority. Douglas gasped. "What was that another plane?" Nadine didn't blink. She knew that outline by heart. F-22 Raptor. And it wasn't alone. A second shadow appeared off the opposite wing. Both fighters flew parallel, close enough that anyone looking out could see their shapes clear against the afternoon sun. Gasps and cries filled the cabin, heads twisted toward windows. Even the blonde in row 11 couldn't mask her panic now. "What are they doing here?" Douglas whispered, his voice trembling. Nadine's heart rate finally quickened, not from fear, but from certainty. The captain had lost contact, or worse, the flight had strayed into restricted airspace, and now the Air Force was watching. She kept her expression even, though inside her training screamed. She had been on the other side of this exact situation. She knew the protocols, the tension, the thin line between safety and chaos. A passenger shouted from the back, "Why are there fighter jets? What's happening?" The flight attendants hurried to calm the cabin, assuring everyone it was routine, precautionary. But Nadine knew routine didn't look like this. Douglas grabbed the armrest, knuckles white. "They're here for us, aren't they? What if something's wrong with the plane?" Nadine turned slowly, her voice level and strong. "Something is wrong, but not with the plane." He stared at her, confused, desperate for clarity. She didn't explain, not yet. Timing mattered, information mattered. The wrong words could cause panic. She had learned that too. Outside the window, the Raptors tightened formation, tilting ever so slightly in unison. A signal. Nadine recognized it instantly, and that was when she knew she couldn't sit silent much longer. But before she spoke, the crew would make a call that would change everything inside that cabin. The intercom clicked on. The captain's voice, usually calm and polished, carried an edge this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Some of you may have noticed the military aircraft flying alongside us. There is no need for alarm. We are in full communication with them, and this is a routine safety escort." It was a good line, meant to quiet the cabin. But Nadine knew the truth. His tone wasn't routine, and escorts didn't appear without reason. The blonde in row 11 shot her hand up like a student in class. "Excuse me, routine? You expect us to believe that?" Her voice shook, carrying through several rows. Other passengers chimed in, voices layering over each other. Why are they so close? Is the plane in trouble? Are we under attack? The attendants moved quickly, hands raised, urging calm. "Please remain seated. Everything is under control." Nadine kept her eyes fixed on the window. The Raptors hadn't pulled away. In fact, they were tighter now, one off each wing. She could almost see the pilots' helmets. Douglas turned to her, whispering urgently, "You don't look surprised. What do you know?" Nadine exhaled slowly. She was tired of whispers, tired of restraint. The cabin was a storm of nerves, and the captain's half-truth wasn't going to hold much longer. She pressed the call button above her seat. A chime echoed. Seconds later, a flight attendant appeared, nervous, cheeks flushed. "Yes, ma'am?" "I need to speak to your captain," Nadine said calmly. The attendant blinked, thrown. "About what?" "About those aircraft. Tell him 12F is requesting to come forward." The woman hesitated. I'm not sure." "Tell him the call sign Falcon 6. He'll understand." Nadine's voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. The attendant froze. The name meant nothing to her, but the certainty in Nadine's eyes gave her pause. After a second too long, she nodded and hurried toward the cockpit. Douglas gawked. "Falcon 6? What is that? Who are you?" Nadine didn't answer him. She leaned back in her seat, water untouched on the tray. For the first time since boarding, her posture carried a weight that couldn't be mistaken for anything ordinary. Murmurs spread in the nearby rows. People had overheard. Whispers bounced back and forth. Did she say Falcon 6? What does that mean? Minutes later, the attendant returned, more composed this time. The captain would like a word with you. The entire row turned their heads as Nadine unbuckled, rose smoothly, and stepped into the aisle. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Every move she made was deliberate, measured. Douglas muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." The blonde in 11E stared openly, her earlier smirk gone. As Nadine approached the cockpit, she could feel eyes burning into her back, questions flying in silence. Who was she? Why was she being invited forward when everyone else was told to stay seated? The door cracked open, just enough for her to slip inside. It shut behind her with a thud, locking the passengers out. Inside, the cockpit was tense. The captain, a man in his 50s with graying hair at the temples, looked up quickly. The first officer gave her a nervous glance. "You said Falcon 6, the captain said without preamble. "Yes." Nadine met his eyes squarely. "And I see your escorts have made visual contact." His brow furrowed. "You're Commander Holt?" She gave a single nod. "Retired. But yes." For a beat, the cockpit fell quiet except for the steady hum of instruments. The captain leaned back, exhaling. "Well, that explains why they're asking for you." "Good," Nadine said simply. "Patch me through." The first officer hesitated. "Ma'am, with respect, we're not supposed to." "Protocol says you keep the cabin calm and coordinate with escort. You've got a calm problem back there, and you've got raptors asking questions you can't answer. Patch me through." The captain studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded to his co-pilot. "Do it." The first officer flicked switches, static filling the headset. A moment later, the line opened. Nadine leaned closer, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spoken this language her whole life. "Raptor flight, this is Falcon 6. Confirm visual." The cockpit went silent, waiting. Then a voice crackled through, sharp but respectful. "Falcon 6, ma'am, is that really you?" The captain's eyes widened. Nadine's lips lifted the slightest bit. "Still here." But respect was one thing. What mattered now was why the Raptors had been scrambled, and the answer wasn't going to ease anyone's nerves. "Falcon 6, ma'am, it's an honor." The pilot's voice over the secure channel carried both relief and disbelief. "We've been ordered to verify your presence. Stand by." The captain leaned closer to the mic. "So it's true? They scrambled Raptors for you?" Nadine's gaze stayed fixed on the panel, steady as ever. "They scrambled Raptors because your route cut across restricted airspace near Langley. But when my name came across the manifest, someone up the chain realized they had another option." The first officer stared. "You mean you?" She nodded once. "Me." Static crackled again, followed by the unmistakable tone of respect. "Falcon 6, request confirmation. Last active posting, Edwards Air Force Base, 22nd Fighter Squadron?" "Confirmed," Nadine replied without hesitation. Her voice didn't waver. "Authorization code, Delta Bravo 21. A beat of silence. Then both Raptors responded together. "Copy that. Falcon 6 in the airspace. Standing by." The captain rubbed a hand down his face. "Well, I'll be damned. They're standing down, aren't they?" Nadine's lips curved, not into a smile exactly, but into something close. "They'll escort us safely, yes, but your passengers won't stay calm unless you give them more than routine lines." The captain hesitated, glancing at his co-pilot. "You want me to tell them who you are?" "They'll know soon enough," Nadine said quietly. "Better it comes from you than whispers." The captain let out a long breath, then nodded. Back in the cabin, the chatter hadn't stopped. Passengers craned their necks toward the cockpit door, voices overlapping. "What's going on? Why did they let her in?" She said something. "Falcon what?" Douglas shifted in his seat, arms crossed tight. "She's not just some passenger," he muttered, though his voice carried more confusion than accusation now. The blonde in row 11 shook her head. "I don't buy it. She's just bluffing." Her companion whispered back. "Then why did the crew let her in?" A sudden chime silenced them. The captain's voice filled the cabin again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you more clarity. The Air Force aircraft outside are here as precaution, yes, but not because of mechanical failure. We briefly entered controlled airspace, and standard procedure brought them alongside. I assure you the situation is stable. A pause, heavy with anticipation. Then he continued. Some of you may have noticed a passenger who stepped into the cockpit. That was at my request. Seat 12F is occupied by Commander Nadine Holt, call sign Falcon 6. She is a retired Air Force squadron commander with over 2 decades of service. The Raptors outside aren't just here for us. They're acknowledging her. She has the respect, and so does this flight. You are safe. Gasps rippled down the rows, heads whipped toward 12F, only to find the seat empty. Douglas blinked, speechless. The blonde's mouth fell open. Commander? Someone whispered. A man across the aisle frowned. She didn't look like a commander. The words stung, even said quietly, but no one answered him. The cockpit door opened again. Nadine stepped back into the cabin. She moved without hurry, her expression unchanged. She returned to 12F, sat down, and buckled in as though nothing unusual had happened. Silence clung to the air. Dozens of eyes followed her. Douglas finally found his voice. So it's true, you... Yes, Nadine said simply, cutting him off. The blonde leaned forward, disbelief etched into her features. You flew those things? She gestured toward the Raptors outside. I commanded them, Nadine corrected softly. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The same people who had smirked and doubted minutes earlier stared at her with a mix of awe and unease. The flight attendant passed by, pausing just long enough to offer Nadine a quiet, genuine smile before moving on. For the first time since boarding, Nadine reached for her water and took a slow sip. Calm, composed, a leader who didn't need to prove anything. But respect given in crisis doesn't erase disrespect shown in peace. And row 12 was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The cabin air felt different now. The whispers that had once carried mockery had turned into hushed awe. People leaned across aisles to murmur to one another, but no one laughed anymore. Douglas shifted uncomfortably in 12D. He cleared his throat, glanced at Nadine, then quickly looked away. For the first time since boarding, the man who had peppered her with questions had nothing to say. His silence wasn't born of arrogance now. It was the awkward silence of someone realizing he'd misjudged badly. The blonde in 11E wasn't quiet, though. She half turned in her seat, eyes wide. Commander Holt, she said, testing the name like it was unfamiliar on her tongue. I didn't mean... Earlier, I didn't mean anything by... Nadine didn't even look at her. She kept her gaze steady on the window, the Raptors still flanking the aircraft in perfect symmetry. The blonde hesitated, then sat back down, cheeks flushed. Douglas finally leaned toward her, lowering his voice. Listen, I may have been out of line before, didn't realize who you were. Nadine turned her head, her eyes meeting his at last. You didn't need to realize who I was to treat me with respect, she said calmly. Douglas flinched slightly, then nodded. Fair enough. He looked down at his empty glass, as if searching for something else to focus on. The cabin stayed unusually quiet after that. No more jokes, no more sideways glances. Every so often, a passenger stole another look at her, but when Nadine's eyes flicked their way, they turned quickly back to their screens or magazines. An hour passed. The turbulence subsided. The Raptor stayed close, a silent reassurance in the sky. At one point, a child from the back, a boy no older than 10, walked up the aisle with his mother. The mother stopped near Nadine's row, smiling nervously. I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am, but my son, he wanted to say hello. The boy's eyes were wide with awe. Did you really fly fighter jets? Nadine's expression softened just slightly. She nodded. I did. Cool, he whispered, before his mom guided him back toward their seats. That small moment broke some of the stiffness in the air. For a few minutes, the cabin felt lighter, passengers exchanging small smiles, maybe remembering what admiration felt like when it wasn't laced with judgment. Douglas spoke again, quieter this time. If you don't mind me asking, why'd you get out? You don't seem like the type to just walk away. Nadine's eyes stayed on the window. I served my time, did what I was called to do, and when it was done, I stepped aside so others could rise. He nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. The blonde in row 11 spoke again, more cautious now. I think it's incredible. Really. You don't meet people like you every day. Nadine finally turned, meeting her gaze directly. You meet people like me every day. You just don't always look closely enough. The blonde swallowed, guilt flashing across her face. She said nothing more. Minutes ticked by, the steady sound of engines filling the silence. Outside, the raptors began to peel away, banking left in perfect unison. Through the window, their wings dipped slightly before they vanished into the horizon. It was subtle, but Nadine knew the gesture. A salute in the sky. The captain's voice returned. Ladies and gentlemen, we've cleared the restricted zone. We'll continue safely to Washington. I'd like to thank our escort for their professionalism and thank one very special passenger for her service. The cabin erupted in applause. Some clapped lightly, others with fervor, but the sound swelled until nearly everyone joined in. Nadine sat still, her hands resting on her lap. She didn't clap with them, didn't bow her head, didn't bask in the recognition. She simply let it happen, quiet and composed, eyes fixed straight ahead. Douglas leaned over again. Guess that's what respect looks like. Nadine didn't answer. She didn't need to. But respect in a moment doesn't erase the lesson that came before, and Nadine knew the real message of 12F wouldn't be applause, but accountability. The rest of the flight passed in a kind of uneasy quiet. Passengers scrolled through their phones, pretended to read, or stared blankly at the seat in front of them. But the truth was, no one's mind was on the in-flight magazine or their next meeting in Washington. Every set of eyes had at some point drifted back to 12F. Commander Nadine Holt sat as she always had, still, calm, unshaken. If you didn't know what had just happened, you might think she was just another tired traveler counting the minutes until landing. But now, everyone knew. The blonde in 11E, who had whispered and smirked at the start of the flight, kept stealing glances over her shoulder. She wanted to say something, an apology maybe, but the words never seemed to find her. Douglas stayed in his seat, shoulders slouched, fiddling with his empty glass. Every so often, he looked like he might speak again, but each time he stopped himself. Nadine's earlier words echoed too loudly. You didn't need to realize who I was to treat me with respect. When the wheels finally touched down at Ronald Reagan National Airport, the applause that had filled the cabin earlier didn't return. Instead, there was a heavy, reflective silence as the plane taxied to the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers stood, stretching, reaching for bags. But row 12 didn't move right away. Nadine stayed seated, waiting, patient. She had no need to rush. As the aisle began to empty, the blonde turned once more. Her voice was soft, almost trembling. Commander Holt, I just want to say I'm sorry for earlier, for the way I... Nadine raised a hand, stopping her, not harshly, but firmly. Don't apologize to me because of what you learned today. Apologize to yourself for what you assumed before you knew. The blonde's eyes welled with tears. She nodded silently and moved on. Douglas lingered, awkward and restless. Finally, he said, You know, I thought respect was earned. I didn't realize it could also be lost so quickly. Nadine looked at him, her tone steady. Respect isn't a prize, it's the baseline. You give it because people deserve it, not because they prove something to you. He held her gaze for a moment, then gave a small, solemn nod. For once, his watch, his glass, his business suit, they didn't make him feel bigger than anyone. They only made him feel smaller. The cabin emptied. Nadine stood at last, retrieving her small carry-on. She walked down the aisle without a word, just as she had boarded. No uniform, no medals, no need for fanfare, just presence. As she stepped out into the terminal, the everyday world swallowed her again. Travelers rushed past, announcements echoed, families reunited. To them, she was just another woman in dark slacks and a cardigan. No one stopped, no one stared, and that, Nadine thought, was the truth of it. People rarely saw past the surface until they were forced to. The flight from Dallas to Washington wasn't about turbulence, or airspace, or fighter jets. It was about what happens when judgment comes first and respect comes last. Too often, people wait until someone reveals their title, their accomplishments, their call sign before treating them with dignity. And too often, that dignity is owed long before. Nadine never raised her voice. She never demanded recognition. She didn't need to. Her life, her record, her discipline, those spoke louder than any defense she could give. But the lesson wasn't hers to learn. It belonged to everyone who whispered, smirked, or doubted in row 12. And maybe it belongs to us too. Because the truth is simple, you never know who you're sitting next to. It could be a commander, a teacher, a nurse, or someone who's carried more weight than you'll ever see. And if the only thing keeping you from respect is ignorance of their resume, then the problem isn't them. It's you. So next time you catch yourself sizing someone up, writing their story before they speak a word, stop. Don't wait for turbulence or call signs or fighter jets to remind you what basic respect looks like. Give it freely, to everyone, every time. Because every person in seat 12F, no matter their name, their title, or their clothes, deserves it. And if this story made you think twice, share it. Let it remind someone else. Respect isn't earned by status. It's owed by humanity.